Hello and welcome to The View from Felaban. I'm Silvia Pavoni, economics editor of The Banker, and I'm talking to Georgina Baker, who is Vice President for Latin America and the Caribbean, Europe and Central Asia at the IFC, the private sector arm of the World Bank. Thank you for joining me, Georgina.
My pleasure.
So I want to ask you about sustainable finance. You're here to talk about sustainable finance. The IFC is becoming a growing issuer of green bonds. You also support the sustainable banking network. Sustainable finance and environmental, social and governance factors are increasingly being discussed in fora such as this as well, Felaban. But also they tend also to be referred to be described as a trend sometimes, perhaps as the topic of the moment. So are you concerned that maybe ESG and sustainable finance in general is a fashion that therefore may go out of fashion soon as well?
Absolutely not. We have been issuing green bonds ourselves since 2010. We have just issued the bonds that took us over to the mark of 10 billion issued green bonds. Climate change is a serious issue, and we at IFC are viewing it as an opportunity to help banks reinvent themselves, to become green banks, to be relevant to millennials who now are very interested in socially conscious and green investing. I think anyone that doesn't take it seriously is going to miss the boat, and 10 years down the road will find themselves irrelevant.
So stakeholders are definitely interested. There are some governments, however, some administrations who tend not to perhaps take it as seriously as others, from Brazil to the US, to the White House. Is it an issue? So how do you see it from a governmental and policy making perspective?
I think it's very important that it's not just banks and companies that are working on this, but it's also the regulatory environment. So we are working with regulators through the Sustainable Banking Network to create an environment where what banks are doing is also embedded in the financial ecosystem. So this is not just one part of, but part of a whole. And what we're doing in the Sustainable Banking Network is bringing the regulators, the Banking Association and the financial institutions together to decide amongst themselves how to advance in their economy and relevant to their country. But it needs to be done with the regulators hand in hand.
And how do you assess the situation in Latin America? So you're here clearly to talk to many of your relations here in Latin America and the Caribbean. How do they fare compared to other parts of the world? So
not as well as they could, and I'm here to sort of challenge the Latin American financial institutions to do more, to step up, to do better. I'm so pleased that IFC has this great relationship with Felaban. We've been working with them closely on this issue of green finance for the last 3 years. It's absolutely front and center of the agenda for this conference, which is very exciting for us. This morning I was talking to the governors about this very issue. They asked me to speak because they care about it. The regulators from Latin America and the banking associations are very involved. But the green issuances in Latin America this year, 3.7 billion, which is 2% of global issuances. And I really think that Latin America can do more and can do better. So there's a lot more that can be done.
Do they need the regulators to be involved? Do they need bankers to just become more aware of what is needed, what is missing?
Bankers need to, first of all, train their staff to understand what are green assets, what can be looked at as green assets. And in fact, we help with training through the IFC Green Banking Academy. So the banks need to have their staff trained, the regulators need to set out the framework, and then banks can then start issuing, either making green investments or using those investments to raise financing through a green bond. You don't need to have all the assets ready. You can have part of the assets backed, part of the bond backed by existing green assets, and the future, and part of the funding will be against future assets. So there's a continuum. And I think the banks are now finding that there are many opportunities in their portfolio already. I talk to many banks who say, no, it's too complicated, I can't do it. And I say, look at your portfolio today. I suspect you will find many assets in your portfolio that are energy efficient buildings, resilient buildings, smart agribusiness. And when you find those assets, you start to realize you're doing it already and you can build more and raise financing against those assets.
So let's hope the banks will be responsive to your encouragements and that indeed ESG and sustainable finance won't be a trend that will go out of fashion.
It will not be a trend. It is here to stay.
Very well. Thank you, Georgina.
My pleasure.